Hello everyone, my name is Rob Webb and welcome to this second video in my series on how I create my images in my living room. For this week we're going to be looking at the theme of high speed. I'm going to take you through the camera setup, the lighting setup, we'll do some processing in Photoshop and Lightroom, and I'll also talk about the theory behind high speed photography. So without further ado, let's get cracking. So for camera settings, we're going to be shooting at f8 with a shutter speed of 0.3 seconds at ISO 200. Obviously we're shooting in manual mode for that. Now we've also got, for ease of use, a shutter release cable, and on top of the camera is the Godox flash transmitter. The lens we're going to be using for this week is the 135 f2L Canon lens. This is a really nice sharp lens. It lets me get a long way away from the subject as well, so there's no risk of splash on the camera. Over to the subject and the working area now. A very similar setup to the one we had last week with the Jack Daniels shot. The reflective cooker splashback and the workbench. On top of the splashback we have a cherry which will be dropping into this glass which will be filled with water. Now we're going to look at the lighting setup. So we have two Godox Wistro flashes, the AD 180 and up here the AD 360. This 360, as you can see, is in a beauty dish, and underneath is a grid. This will direct the light from the flash straight down onto the subject. The other Wistro is actually underneath the table and it's pointing at this grey wall. Now the idea is the light will bounce off of the grey wall, which will turn the wall white, and hit the back of the glass. Now the reason for hitting the back of the glass is that prevents any reflections from going into the camera lens. All the light is from the back. This light will actually light the cherry from the bounce back up from the reflective surface. Before we start shooting properly, there are a couple of things I like to have on hand when I'm doing these kind of shots. The first is a nice big towel. We're going to create a lot of water splashes, there's going to be a lot of mess. It's good to have something on hand to clear it up. The second thing is a nice long pair of forceps. This makes getting in to get your item out of the water so much easier, and it also means you're not displacing a load more water out the side of the glass when you get your fingers in there. Fingers are obviously bigger than these. The last thing I like to have underneath the glass is a very small piece of duct tape. Now, you may not be able to see this on either of the videos I've got set up, but there's a piece of duct tape just here. It makes it much easier when you're cleaning up mess and you've got this moved out of the way to put it back in exactly the same place, so you don't need to recompose your shot, refocus, you can get straight back on and shoot again. Before I do a live drop into the water, I generally like to have a couple of practice goes with no water in the glass. This gives me the opportunity to test my timing. It also makes sure that the composition is right, that my light is okay. It's generally just a good idea before you start making a mess to actually have a practice go. So I'm going to do that now. Remember, the idea is to try and trigger the flash and the camera just as the cherry is going to make the biggest splash. So here we go. Now I think on that occasion I was actually a little bit late with the shot. So I'm going to have another couple of practices and then we'll come back for a live go. So I've had a test go, or a couple of test goes, and I'm pretty happy with how it's all looking. So now I'm going to try a live drop into the water, trying to capture the biggest splash I can, trying to get the cherry in the right place. So let's have a go and we'll see how it turns out. This is going to be messy. Or not in that case. So I think that was actually quite a disappointing splash. So I'm going to have another couple of goes, probably off camera, then we'll go into some processing in Lightroom and Photoshop. Before we get into processing, I think it would be a really good idea to have a very brief understanding of how high-speed photography with flashes actually works. So to do that, we need to recall the camera settings from the start of the video, and you may remember I said we were shooting at f8 and at 0.3 of a second. Now you may be wondering why with that kind of shutter speed we don't see a blurred cherry falling through the air. Now that is because at f8 in an ambiently lit room there simply is not enough light hitting the sensor to record anything other than blackness. Now this is the same principle we used last week with the Jack Daniels bottle, where turning the flashes off, it just showed nothing. There was nothing recorded on the sensor whatsoever. Now in this kind of shot, what we're actually looking for is the flash duration, i.e. the amount of time that the flash is illuminating the scene for. With these Godox flashes set at 164 power, they actually only flash for 1/7500th of a second. Now that is incredibly brief. But it effectively means that regardless of what your shutter speed is actually set to, its equivalent shutter speed is the same duration as the flashes, because that is all that is recorded by the sensor. It's just that brief single moment where the flash is illuminating the scene, because that is the only moment that the sensor can see. All the rest of the time, it's black. Now, you may be thinking, why can't we shoot faster than 0.3 of a second? And we can, but there is a limit on how fast we can shoot. And that is basically a limit of DSLR shutters. Now, you may know if you do flash photography that the sync speed is 250. And that is because the way the shutter, or the way the curtain on the shutter drops through the scene, if you go too much faster than that, you start to record the shutter or the curtain falling down through the scene. And this is because the image is scanned onto the sensor in lines and the shutter is falling down. So what you get is an edge of curtain and then a bit of scene and then black, which is the rest of the curtain. And that is because it's falling through like that. So I find that 0.3 or 0.5 of a second is just that perfect degree. Now you can go slower. You can go to 1 second or 2 seconds. But what you don't want to do is start to get a long exposure effect actually working. You don't want to be able to see the scene recorded when there's no flash. So if you do a 2 second exposure and you can start to see the edges with no flash illuminating the scene, then you've gone too far and you need to dial back your exposure. You need to dial back the shutter speed to being much quicker. As I say, 0.3, 0.5, that is where I find the sweet spot normally is. In Lightroom now, and this is the image we're going to be looking at processing. It was the best of the ones once I'd gone through and looked at all the shots I'd managed to take. It had a nice big splash. The cherry is very visible and very red, which is good. However, it does have a number of imperfections particularly in the reflective surface that we'll need to look at clearing up. As you can see, there's some smears down here from where where I cleaned up old bits of water droplets that were like this one that are coming out across this way. There's also some specks and some smears down here. Now some of this we can actually look at doing in Lightroom, because the spot removal tool in Lightroom will work very well for that. So actually let's do that first. So up on the taskbar we can click on the spot removal. Make the tool reasonably small because we don't want huge spots to be taken out, and we can just click on these areas here in turn, trying to catch the edges without catching too much of the other bits. Now we can probably, with a slightly bigger brush, scoop these ones up as well. Lightroom is very good at occasionally going straight back over the top of one you actually want to clean up next. And there's a couple of bits down here as well that we can look to get rid of. We really want this whole area to be clear and devoid of any kind of imperfections. So that's a good start, I think. Got some more up here to do. So I think the next thing to do is actually take it into Photoshop, and we'll look at getting rid of all of these areas here, which is beyond the scope of the of the spot removal tool in Lightroom. So here's the image in Photoshop, and I think the first thing we should do is duplicate this layer, just so we've got something to fall back on should the cloning or the patching go awry. It'll also give us something to look at to compare how we're doing. So to do that, Control J or Command J on a Mac, and we'll start working on this layer. Now we're going to get the patch tool. This is a really powerful tool for manipulating areas where you've got imperfections. And the way I like to do this normally is to start with the smaller areas first, because that gives us more room when we come to these big patches to actually put it into place. So we'll start up there with this small one. It's normally better to follow the light, and it's also, you need the patch mode set to normal. It's really important not to have it set to content aware. If you have it set to content aware, you may find that you get really weird imperfections showing up in the patched area. So we just draw around each one as neatly as we can, but you don't have to be particularly exact, and try and match. Normally it's your best to go up or down in these kinds of situations. And to get rid of the marching ants, obviously we do Control D, Command D on the Mac, and that gets rid of those. Now if we go quite close in, we can really see where these areas are. Another one there, and you can see that's probably going too dark, but above it that looks perfect. And you can see that it just does absolutely disappear. Now large areas like this are sometimes more tricky to patch, because you're going through quite a gradient of lighting, but hopefully just by going straight up, yeah, that's absolutely fine. Now we're getting some repeated areas here, and that is another thing you have to watch out for with the patch tool, that you don't get blobs of obviously re-cloned areas, because it does, the eye immediately picks them up and sees them as being something that isn't quite right. Another good thing to do is to keep zooming back out and seeing how it looks from afar, because although you're right in tight, it's very difficult to see what the whole image looks like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work through these until I can get to the bigger one. And what I might do is actually break this bigger one up into smaller chunks as well. Although it looks like there might be a line I can bring it through there, maybe, but what I might do first is actually tackle this bit. If you can work in smaller chunks, that is much better. And that leaves me with this bit and this bit to deal with. So what I might do is actually go in a bit closer. See if we can take this bit off first. And then try and get this bit, which is obviously very close to the glass. Be quite careful how close we get here. We may need to back this back off. The clipping line is very useful for that. Now you can just see there's a bit of an edge that we might be able to deal with. Yeah. So things like this, it's actually probably best to leave, because although it looks huge when you're that close, when you actually zoom out, it's very difficult to see where that actually was. There's a circular spot that I missed in Lightroom that we can deal with now. So I'm actually going to tackle this large blob now, and we'll see how we get on. This is a very large patch, so it'll be a bit of a test of Lightroom's capabilities, but as I say, we'll see how we go. And I think that is actually pretty perfect. See from there that you couldn't tell that there was a spot there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through and deal with all of these other little bits. I'll stop the video because, to be honest, there isn't much different that I'll be doing, and we'll come back to some more processing in a minute. The next thing I want to tackle are these areas here. Now you can see that there's some golden light that's somehow managed to hit the bottom of the glass. We've also got these rainbow effects in the water that are refractions, creating a rainbow. But what we don't want to do is lose this nice red. So the easiest way to deal with that is to create a new hue saturation layer. And what we're going to do is take the saturation of this layer right down. Now, as you can see, that gets rid of the red. Gets rid of all colour. Now, we could paint the red back in on the mask. But what I prefer to do, because it's easier for me, is actually take this layer mask and invert it. Now that puts all the colour back in. But with a white brush we can actually just paint it back out. So we're making sure that the mask is selected. We're not painting on the actual layer, we're painting on the mask. We're just going to go around and paint out all the colour. So this, remember, it's a white brush because it's a black layer mask. You want to not touch, if possible, the cherry or its stem. You just want to go around and pick up all of these areas from around it. Now that's clearly a reflection of the cherry in a bubble, but I'm not sure it actually works, so I'm going to take it out. There's one there as well, and all of this around here. Just taking it down to black and white. I think it makes the water somehow look cleaner and more defined if there's no random colours in it. Although it doesn't, obviously not like natural water would be, because natural water does have these rainbow reflections in it. So let's zoom out and see how that looks now. There's one there actually that I missed. While I was doing the patching, I was half considering removing these droplets, but to be honest I don't think they're distracting to the actual final shot. In fact, I think they add a bit of texture and a bit of colour. Talking of colour, another bit down there that we can get rid of. So that's that bit done. We can Control Shift and E to flatten these layers down into one now. Command Shift and E on a Mac, I believe, although I don't know for sure. I'm going to also do the sharpening trick that I showed you last week in the video. So let's duplicate and create a layer. Put the layer inside the folder and duplicate it again. Set the folder to overlay. Set that layer to vivid light, which makes it pretty insane. And then invert the layer. Now come up to the filter, blur, surface blur. And again we get this inverted view, and you can really see the details. Now remember not to go over 10, but we will tweak it up to 10 and maybe take the threshold up a bit, because in this kind of shot it doesn't hurt to have a little bit more definition. In a portrait you really don't want it. It really starts to make it look like a kind of over-processed HDR shot. But with this, where there's no facial expressions and we really want to gain the most detail, particularly in the skin of this cherry and the depth of splash in the water, it doesn't hurt to really push at that 10 limit. So we'll hit OK and let it do its job.
and I think you can see it's much more obvious certainly than it was in the JD shot, particularly if we zoom into the cherry. You can see how it really brings out the texture there. You get much more definition across the lines of the glass and in the water. So now we'll go back to Lightroom and we'll do some more playing with sliders in Lightroom. Here's the final image in Lightroom. The only other thing I've done outside of the video was run this image through Define from Nik Tools to clean up some of the noise. There was a little bit of noise creeping in over here just from the processing we did in Photoshop. So now I'm going to finish off very briefly with some tweaks in Lightroom. I'm going to do this very briefly because this video is dragging on quite a bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually the opposite of what you expect, and that is take the clarity down, because I want these edges to be nicely blurred. I'm also going to put some contrast in, and then I'm going to paint in some clarity with the paintbrush tool. And we're just going to paint in over the areas on the glass. You want to come down and do the reflection as well. And also what I'm going to do with this same brush is pull the blacks down. And the shadows ever so slightly. We don't want to go too far because it will take this lower area really very dark. But we do want the nice catch of darkness in this splash. So I think that's enough for now. What I might also do, actually I think I'll do it on the image itself, is ever so slightly pull up the vibrance and saturation. Like that. Now one of the other tools that is quite fun to use, and this is only in the later versions of Lightroom, I forget from which version, but you certainly need 2015 and one of the latest versions of 2015, and that's the dehaze tool. Now this creates quite strong effects if you push it too far. If you go the other way, it really does blow the image out. This is meant for landscape scenes where you've got a haze in the distance and it kind of brings some details back. It's a bit like the clarity tool, but it doesn't quite give you the same definition of edge that the clarity tool does. It darkens down more. I'm actually going to dehaze this image, not massively, just enough to darken up some of the edges and redefine the edges. I like this idea that there is a central spotlighted area behind the glass that then falls away to more shadow over in the corners. So I actually think that I'm going to leave this image there. I don't think I want to do too much else. Although saying that, let's actually have a quick tweak of contrast. So with the curve tool, if we create anchor points on the crosses and just see where we go here. So just taking that vignette out slightly by creating an S-shaped curve. I know lifted blacks and lifted whites are a bit cliche, but let's see where we go by just slightly lifting the whites. Sorry, lifting the blacks and dropping the whites. Yeah. So I quite like that. That will probably stay as the image. So that's the end of the video. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe, please like the video, please leave a comment. Once again, I welcome any feedback. This is the second video in the series, so there'll probably be a little bit of a break now before I do a third one. But if you've got anything you would like me to do or anything you would like a video on, then please leave a comment or drop me a message and I'll do my best to work on it.